What would you do if you saw a homeless person feeling ill on the street? Would you ignore them and continue on your way? Or would you stop to help? It was exactly this dilemma that Alexandre Ribeiro, owner of a fortune estimated at 15 billion reais, decided to create for Isabella, the woman who was about to marry his only son and heir. Alexandre Ribeiro's duplex penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of the most exclusive building on Paulista Avenue. From there, he could contemplate the infinite horizon of São Paulo, a city he had helped shape with his real estate developments over the past 4 decades. At 68, Alexandre maintained the upright posture and sharp gaze that intimidated executives in meeting rooms, but his completely white hair and the deep lines around his eyes told the story of a man who had paid a high price for success. That October morning, Alexandre was having his coffee on the veranda while leafing through the quarterly financial reports of his holding company. Jose, the butler who had served him for more than 20 years, approached discreetly. "Sir, your son has just arrived." Alexandre nodded without raising his eyes from the documents. A few seconds later, Rafael entered the veranda with a smile that lit up his 32-year-old face. Tall like his father, but with the soft features he had inherited from his deceased mother, Rafael had the contagious energy that Alexandre had lost years ago. "Dad, I need to talk to you." Alexandre finally raised his eyes. "I'm busy, Rafael. Can we talk later? It's important." Rafael sat in the chair across from his father, ignoring the slight irritation he noticed in his gaze. "I'm going to propose to Isabella." The silence that followed weighed between the two men. Alexandre slowly placed the coffee cup on the table. "You've known her for less than a year. So what? When you know, you know." Alexandre took a deep breath. He remembered saying the same words to his own father 40 years ago, when he announced he would marry Helena after only 6 months of dating. The marriage lasted 15 years until cancer took his wife, leaving him alone with a 10-year-old son to raise. "Rafael, I'm not saying Isabella isn't a good girl. She seems pleasant, but you are the sole heir to an empire that took me decades to build. You need to be certain." Rafael closed his eyes for a moment, containing his frustration. "Dad, don't start with this. Isabella is not like Carolina." Alexandre crossed his arms. Carolina had been Rafael's first fiancée 3 years ago, an internationally known model who, as Alexandre had suspected from the beginning, was more interested in his son's bank account than his feelings. The breakup came when Rafael discovered she was cheating on him with a European film director, shortly after they had signed a prenuptial agreement that would guarantee her a fortune in case of divorce. "I know you believe that," said Alexandre, "but you also believed in Carolina." Rafael stood up, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "Isabella is a public school teacher, Dad. She lives in a rented apartment and drives a car that's more than 10 years old. She didn't even want me to pay for an apartment for us." Alexandre narrowed his eyes. It was true that Isabella seemed different. In the few encounters they had, she showed disinterest in the financial matters that Carolina always sought to understand. Still, his life experience had made him skeptical. "People can surprise you when a lot of money is at stake, son." Rafael let out a bitter laugh. "You think everyone is like you, don't you? That everything comes down to money and power." The words hit Alexandre like a physical blow. For a moment, he saw in his son the reflection of Helena, his late wife, who frequently accused him of the same thing. The businessman slowly stood up. "I'll propose something," said Alexandre, his voice calculatedly calm. "I'll invite Isabella to have lunch with me this weekend. Alone. If I'm satisfied with what I see, you have my blessing." Rafael's face lit up. "Really? That would be great, Dad. With one condition," continued Alexandre. "You won't tell her anything about this lunch being a kind of evaluation. I want to see her as she really is, not as she wants me to see her." Rafael hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "All right, but promise you'll be fair." Alexandre smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm always fair, son." What Rafael didn't know was that his father had no plans to take Isabella to any lunch. After his son's departure, Alexandre called Marcelo, his head of security and trusted confidant for more than 15 years. "I need you to organize something for me," said Alexandre, detailing his true plan. A test for Isabella that would reveal her true nature. 3 days later, Alexandre was unrecognizable. The special effects makeup artist who worked for his film production company had done an exceptional job. Deeper wrinkles marked his face, a graying and unkempt beard covered his chin, and a disheveled wig completed the transformation. Wearing old and dirty clothes that Marcelo had bought at a thrift store, Alexandra looked exactly as he intended, an elderly homeless person invisible to most people passing through downtown Sao Paulo. Strategically positioned on the path that Isabella took daily between the subway station and the school where she taught, Alexandra waited for the right moment to execute his test. Marcelo observed everything from a distance, ready to intervene if necessary. When Isabella appeared around the corner, Alexandra felt a pang of guilt. She walked with quick steps, carrying a folder and a paper bag, probably containing her lunch. She wore a simple skirt and a blouse with no visible designer brand, very different from Raphael's ex-girlfriends. Alexandra took a deep breath and began his performance. He staggered toward her, pressing a hand against his chest and letting out a groan of pain loud enough to be heard. Then, he fell to his knees on the sidewalk, dropping the small can with some coins he was holding, scattering them on the ground. Now would come the test. Alexandra observed out of the corner of his eye as Isabella noticed his fall. She hesitated for a second that to Alexandra seemed to confirm all his suspicions. But then she approached. "Sir, are you okay? Do you need help?" Alexandra muttered, keeping his head down to avoid her recognizing him, despite the elaborate disguise. His voice came out hoarse, unrecognizable. Isabella immediately put her folder and bag on the ground and knelt beside him, not caring about the dirt on the sidewalk that stained her light-colored skirt. "Someone call an ambulance!" she shouted to the passers-by, most of whom averted their gaze, quickening their pace as if the scene were contagious. No one stopped. Alexandra felt Isabella's small, firm hands touch his shoulder, then his wrist, searching for a pulse. The gentle touch and genuine concern in her eyes surprised him. He hadn't expected such an immediate reaction. "Sir, can you tell me your name? Do you have any medication with you?" Isabella spoke clearly, but her voice trembled slightly, revealing anxiety. Alexandra mumbled something unintelligible, continuing his act. He observed as she opened her purse and took out her cell phone. "I'm going to call an ambulance right now. Stay calm." While Isabella dialed, Alexandra reflected on how he should proceed. The initial plan was just to check if she would stop to help, but her reaction was going beyond what he expected. The ambulance would complicate everything. Doctors would certainly realize he was pretending. From a distance, he saw Marcelo make a discreet gesture, questioning if he should intervene. Alexandra blinked twice, the agreed signal for no. "Emergency, please. There's a gentleman feeling ill on Augusta Street at number 520. It seems to be a heart problem." Isabella spoke on the phone with surprising calmness. "Yes, I'm with him. No, he's conscious, but having difficulty speaking." Alexandra decided to change the course of the act. He breathed more deeply and straightened his shoulders a bit. No need for an ambulance," he said, forcing his voice to sound a little stronger, but still vulnerable. "I just need my medicine. In my backpack." Isabella hesitated, with the phone still to her ear. "Are you sure, sir? The ambulance is already on its way." "I'm sure. Please, cancel." Isabella said a few more words on the phone before hanging up. Then, she turned her full attention to Alexandra. "Where is your backpack, sir?" Alexandra pointed to an old and worn backpack that Marcelo had strategically placed a few meters away. Isabella went to it, picking it up carefully. "Is this it?" Alexandra nodded. He felt a pang of guilt as he watched her open the backpack with such respect, a respect that few people showed for someone homeless. Inside the backpack, as planned, there was an empty bottle of nitroglycerin, a common medication for angina, along with some ragged and dirty belongings. Alexandra observed Isabella examine the empty bottle with growing concern. "Your medicine is gone," she said, returning to his side. "Do you have somewhere to get more?" Alexandra shook his head. "I don't have money," he muttered. Isabella looked quickly at her watch. Alexandra realized she would probably be late for work. It was the crucial moment of the test. Would she choose her professional obligation or continue helping a stranger? "There's a pharmacy at the next corner," said Isabella, determined. "I'll buy your medicine. Can you wait here, or would you prefer me to help you go there?" The question caught Alexandra off guard. In 40 years managing one of the country's largest companies, he had learned to anticipate people's reactions, to calculate their motivations. But he hadn't anticipated this level of commitment. I can wait," he replied, trying to buy time to recalibrate his plan. "Don't worry, Isabella smiled as she picked up her purse. I'll be back in 5 minutes. What's your name? Augusto, Alexandra replied, using the middle name he rarely mentioned. Don't worry, Mr. Augusto. I'll be right back. Alexandra watched Isabella run toward the pharmacy. When she disappeared from view, Marcelo quickly approached. What now, sir? Do we end the test? She clearly passed. Alexandra was silent for a few seconds. No, he finally said. Let's continue. I want to see how far this kindness goes. Marcelo seemed uncomfortable. Sir, with all due respect, she has already shown herself to be a decent person. She's missing work to help someone she believes to be a stranger in need. Exactly why I want to continue, Alexandra replied firmly. Carolina also knew how to be charming when necessary. I want to see how Isabella reacts when there's nothing more to gain. Marcelo nodded reluctantly and moved away again, while Alexandra resumed his position. Less than 5 minutes later, as promised, Isabella returned running, holding a small bag from the pharmacy. I got it, Mr. Augusto, she said out of breath. The pharmacist explained to me how to use it. We need to place this under your tongue. She opened the generic nitroglycerin bottle. Alexandra felt trapped by his own trap. If he took the medication, he could have unnecessary side effects. Nitroglycerin rapidly lowers blood pressure. If he refused, he might arouse suspicion. First, some water? He asked, trying to buy time. Of course. Isabella quickly opened her water bottle and offered it to him. Alexandra took a small sip, observing her over the edge of the bottle. Her eyes showed genuine concern. The medicine now, please, he said, deciding he would deal with the medication's effects. It was more important to maintain the farce. Isabella gently placed a pill under Alexandra's tongue, according to the instruction. He felt the bitter taste and the characteristic tingling sensation of the dissolving medication. Let's wait a few minutes for it to take effect, she said softly. Do you have any family members I can notify? Alexandra shook his head. My family doesn't want to know about me. He observed how her expression changed, not to pity, but to a kind of respectful understanding. I understand. Do you live nearby? Nowhere. Everywhere, he answered vaguely. Isabella nodded without asking more questions about his situation. Instead, she said, I'm worried about leaving you alone after this scare. Would you accept going to a hospital with me? We don't need to call an ambulance. We can take a taxi. Alexandra began to feel the effects of the nitroglycerin, a slight dizziness and heat in his face. It wasn't dangerous, but it reinforced his act. I can't afford a hospital. Don't worry about that now, Isabella insisted. Then she seemed to hesitate before adding, I was going to teach, but I can call the school and ask someone to substitute for me today. Alexandra widened his eyes, surprised by the offer. No, you can't lose your job because of me. I won't lose my job, she smiled. I have credit with the principal. I've covered for many colleagues who missed work. At that moment, Isabella's cell phone rang. She looked at the screen and Alexandra noticed a subtle change in her expression. Excuse me, I need to answer this, she said, moving just a few steps away. Alexandra sharpened his ears, managing to hear parts of the conversation. Hi, love. No, I haven't arrived at school yet. An emergency came up. No, I'm fine, but I found a gentleman feeling ill on the street. Yes, I'm with him now. I don't know, I think I'll take him to the emergency room. No, don't worry, you don't need to come. I'll call you later. It was Raphael. Alexandra felt a wave of guilt as he realized he was making Isabella lie to his son, not technically, but by omission, since she didn't know who she was really helping. When Isabella returned, Alexandra decided to take the next step in the test. Was that your boyfriend? He asked, seeming to just make casual conversation. Isabella smiled. My fiancé, actually. We're planning to get married soon. He seems to care about you. Yes, she replied, and Alexandra noticed a sparkle in her eyes. He's wonderful. People tend to judge him without knowing him just because he comes from a wealthy family. But Raphael has the most generous heart I've ever known. Alexandra swallowed hard, feeling the bitter taste of nitroglycerin mixed with that of guilt. Wealthy, huh? You're going to have a good life then, he provoked, wanting to test her reaction. Isabella frowned slightly. You know, that's not why I'm with him. In fact, at the beginning, that almost made me give up. Why? Alexandra asked, genuinely curious now. Because I saw what money did to my own family, she replied, sitting beside him on the sidewalk, apparently forgetting for a moment that she was talking to a homeless stranger. My father was a simple man. a bus driver. When he won the lottery 10 years ago, he completely changed. The money transformed him into someone I barely recognized. He ended up losing everything in bad investments and alcohol. My mother couldn't take it and left him. Alexandra felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his act. That was a part of Isabella's life that Raphael had never mentioned. "So you don't like money?" he asked, testing her. Isabella smiled sadly. "It's not that I don't like money. I just learned that it's no guarantee of happiness. In fact, sometimes it can complicate everything." She paused. "Are you feeling better? The color is returning to your face?" Alexandra nodded, surprised by the ease with which she redirected the conversation to his well-being. "A little better," he admitted. "Thanks to you." "Good," she smiled. "Look, I really don't feel comfortable leaving you alone after this scare. Let's do this. I'll accompany you to the hospital for a quick checkup, then we can see about getting more of your medicine." Before Alexandra could protest, she was already standing, extending her hand to help him up. It was at this moment that he realized the test had completely spun out of his control. Taking the fast to a hospital would be too imprudent. Doctors would certainly notice the act. "Actually," he said, remaining seated, "I'm feeling much better now. I think it was just a scare. The medicine has already taken effect." Isabella looked uncertain. "Are you sure? Heart problems are no joke, Mr. Augusto." Alexandra nodded, trying to appear more recovered. I've been dealing with this for years. I know when it's serious and when it's not." She hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave him. "At least let me buy a few more pills for you to have in case of emergency," she insisted. Alexandra knew he needed to end the situation before it got even more complicated. "You've already done too much," he said, with sincerity that transcended his act. "You've already lost work time, spent your money on me." "Don't say that," Isabella interrupted, her voice firm. "It wasn't a waste of time. And as for the money, it was only 35 reais. It won't be missed." "Even so," Alexandra continued, "I need to thank you somehow." "You don't need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same." Alexandra almost laughed at the irony. "No, they wouldn't. Dozens of people passed by me today and none of them stopped." Isabella seemed genuinely sad at this observation. "That's a shame, but I really didn't do anything special." Alexandra got up slowly, still maintaining the slightly curved posture of his character. "I have something to give you," he said, rummaging in the pocket of his dirty pants. From there, he took out a small, smooth, round stone, something he had picked up from the garden of his mansion that morning for no apparent reason. "It's just an ordinary stone," he explained, offering it to Isabella. "But I've kept it for a long time. They say stones absorb energy. If that's true, this one must be full of stories." Isabella hesitated before accepting the unusual gift. When she finally did, she held the stone carefully, as if it was something precious. "Thank you," she said, seeming touched by the simple gesture. "I'll keep it." Alexandra felt strangely moved, seeing her put the stone in her purse. It was a moment of genuine human connection, something he rarely experienced in his world of business and appearances. "Now go," he said softly. "I don't want to be responsible for more delays in your work." "Are you sure you'll be all right?" "Absolutely," Alexandra assured. Isabella still seemed reluctant. "Look, I come this way every day between 7:30 and 8 in the morning. If you need anything at all, be here at that time." She took a paper and pen from her purse, writing quickly. "And here's my number. If you have access to a phone." Alexandra took the paper, surprised by her continued generosity. "Thank you," he said, putting the number in his pocket, knowing he would never use it. "Promise you'll take care of yourself," Isabella insisted. "I promise," replied Alexandra, feeling the weight of that promise, even as part of a farce. After a few more assurances, Isabella finally agreed to go on her way, not without looking back several times, as if wanting to make sure he really was okay. When she finally disappeared around the corner, Marcelo reappeared beside Alexandra. "She passed the test, sir," said Marcelo, in a tone that made it clear he considered the exercise concluded. Alexandra remained silent, observing the direction in which Isabella had departed. His initial plan, a simple test to verify her compassion, had revealed much more than he expected. "It's not over yet," he finally said. "I want to see if she will mention this to Raphael, and if she comes back tomorrow to look for me as promised." Marcelo seemed increasingly uncomfortable. "Don't you think you're going too far? She seems to be genuinely a good person." "That's exactly what I need to confirm," replied Alexandra. "True goodness is consistent, not an isolated act." As they returned to the car parked a few blocks away, Alexandra couldn't stop thinking about the story Isabella had shared about her father. The irony didn't escape him. He was using his power and wealth to test his son's fiancée, in the same way that money had negatively transformed her father. That night, Alexandra anxiously awaited the moment when Raphael would return home. He wanted to know if Isabella had mentioned the incident. To his surprise, when his son arrived, around 9 at night, he seemed completely normal, without any indication that he knew what had happened. "How was your day?" Alexandra casually asked during dinner. "Normal," replied Raphael, distracted by his phone. "Meetings, emails, more meetings, the usual. And Isabella, did you talk to her today?" Raphael looked at his father with slight suspicion. Since announcing his marriage plans, Alexandra rarely asked about Isabella voluntarily. "Yes, I did. She had a complicated day at school. It seems a teacher was absent and she had to cover 2 classes at the same time." Alexandra frowned. Had Isabella lied to Raphael? Or was Raphael lying to him? Or perhaps, the most likely possibility, Isabella simply didn't want to worry her fiancé with the morning's incident. "Are you seeing each other tonight?" asked Alexandra. "No," replied Raphael. "She's preparing tests for tomorrow. But we're having lunch together." "Why?" Alexandra shrugged, trying to appear casual. "No reason. Just curious." The rest of dinner proceeded in relative silence, with Alexandra lost in thought. Isabella's decision not to mention the incident to Raphael was intriguing. Could it mean that she didn't want to appear as a heroine in her fiancé's eyes? Or that she considered the act of helping someone so normal that it wasn't even worth mentioning? The next morning, Alexandra was again positioned in the same location with a slightly different disguise, equally shabby clothes, but of different colors and a slightly more trimmed beard. He didn't want Isabella to recognize him immediately, but he was curious to see if she would fulfill her promise to look for Augusto. At 7:40, Isabella appeared at the corner. Alexandra observed her from a distance. Noticing how her eyes scanned the sidewalk, clearly looking for someone, she slowed her pace as she approached the spot where she had found Alexandra the day before, looking around with growing concern. "She really came looking for me," Alexandra muttered to himself, feeling a mixture of surprise and guilt. Isabella stopped exactly where they had met, looking in all directions. After a few minutes, she approached a coffee vendor who had a small stand nearby. Alexandra couldn't hear the conversation, but it was clear that Isabella was asking about the elderly man who had fallen ill there the day before. The vendor just shook his head, apparently without useful information. The scene touched Alexandra in a way he hadn't expected. Isabella could have simply gone on with her life, satisfied with the good deed of the previous day. Instead, she was there, concerned about the well-being of a complete stranger, potentially being late for work again. When Isabella finally continued on her way after leaving her phone number with the coffee vendor, Alexandra felt something rare, a mixture of shame and admiration. She had passed his test with distinction, and he continued to doubt her. Guilt began to gnaw at Alexandra as he returned to the car where Marcelo was waiting. "Well?" asked his security guard. "She came," replied Alexandra simply. "She was looking for me." Marcelo nodded, as if he already expected this answer. "Is the test over now, sir?" Alexandra remained silent for a few seconds before responding. "Not yet. Act 3. Crisis and Confrontation." 3 days had passed since the first encounter between Alexandra and Isabella. During this period, the businessman had observed from a distance as she continued to search for the homeless man she had helped. Each morning, Isabella arrived a little earlier to the spot, apparently hoping to find Augusto again. On the 3rd day, she even brought a small bag that Alexandra suspected contained food or other supplies. Her persistence impressed him and at the same time intensified his feeling of guilt. But Alexandra was not satisfied. In his mind, there was still the possibility that Isabella was acting. Perhaps she had somehow discovered who he was, or perhaps she simply liked to see herself as a charitable person. "I need a final test," Alexandra informed Marcelo on the morning of the 4th day. "Something that goes beyond simple, momentary generosity. Don't you think you've gone far enough?" Marcelo questioned, not hiding his disapproval. In the 15 years working for Alexandra, he had never seen his boss so obsessed with something. "It's my son's future at stake," Alexandra replied dryly. I need to be absolutely certain. Marcello sighed, resigned. What's the plan then? The next day, Alexandra was again transformed into Augusto, this time with the original disguise. He positioned himself in the same spot, aware that Isabella would probably arrive in a few minutes. Sitting on the ground with his back against the wall of a commercial building, he held a small handwritten sign. Need help for heart medicine. Any help is welcome. As expected, Isabella appeared at the corner a few minutes later. Her eyes scanned the street until they fixed on the familiar figure sitting against the wall. For a moment, she seemed to freeze, then quickened her pace toward him. Mr. Augusto, she exclaimed, kneeling beside him without any hesitation. I was so worried. You disappeared after that day. Alexandra felt a wave of guilt seeing the genuine relief on her face. I had to leave the area for a few days, he muttered, keeping his voice altered. I got a temporary place to sleep in another neighborhood. Isabella's eyes fell on the improvised sign. Do you need more medicine? Did you use up what I bought? Alexandra nodded. I used the last one yesterday. I'll buy more for you right now, she said, already opening her purse. No, Alexandra stopped her. I don't want to abuse your kindness anymore. You've already done too much for me. Isabella shook her head, resolute. It's no abuse at all. I want to help. It was then that Alexandra put the final part of his test into action. Actually, he said slowly, I need more than just medicine. He made a strategic pause. My grandson is sick. Pneumonia. He's in the public hospital, but the doctor said he needs a medication that the healthcare system doesn't provide. It costs almost 500 reais. He carefully observed Isabella's reaction. He saw her eyes widen slightly at the mentioned amount, a significant sum for a public school teacher. I've been trying to gather this money for weeks, continued Alexandra, hating himself for every word of the elaborate lie. I've only managed to get 90 reais so far. Isabella was silent for a few seconds, clearly processing the information. Alexandra expected to see hesitation, perhaps even suspicion, perfectly normal reactions to such a substantial request from a stranger. Instead, she opened her purse and began to check her wallet. I have 200 reais with me, she finally said. It's all the cash I have right now. But, she hesitated before continuing, I can withdraw more after class. How much more do you need to complete the medication cost? Alexandra felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He hadn't expected her to offer practically all the money she carried without asking a single question about the veracity of his story. I can't accept your money, he said, his voice faltering slightly. Why not? Asked Isabella, seeming genuinely confused. Because you barely know me. I could be lying. Isabella smiled softly. You could be, yes, but I prefer to believe you're not. And even if you were, she shrugged, I would lose 200 reais, but my conscience would be clear. If I don't help and your story is true, how could I live with myself knowing I could have done something? The silence that followed was deafening to Alexandra. Throughout his business life, he had learned to distrust, to question motives, to look for the hidden angle in every generous offer. And there was this woman, willing to hand over her savings to a complete stranger based solely on faith in human kindness. Alexandra felt his eyes moisten, a reaction that wasn't part of his act. Your grandson, Isabella continued, apparently interpreting his emotion as concern. How old is he? The question caught Alexandra off guard. He hadn't elaborated so many details in his fictional story. 7, he replied after a brief hesitation. His name is Miguel. Miguel. Isabella repeated the name with affection. You know, I have several students that age. They're extraordinary, so curious, so full of life. As Isabella talked about her students, Alexandra noticed that she had already separated some bills. The simple gesture made him feel infinitely small. This woman, who probably earned a 20th of what he paid his executives, was ready to sacrifice her own comfort for a stranger. Actually, Alexandra said, unable to continue with the farce, I don't need the money. Isabella frowned, confused. But your grandson's medicine. I don't have a grandson, Alexandra confessed, his voice breaking. I don't even have children. He saw the confusion on her face transform into something more complex. Not anger, as he expected, but a kind of understanding sadness. I understand, she said softly. Sometimes life takes us to extremes to survive. Alexandra realized she had misinterpreted his confession. She thought he was admitting to having invented the grandson story to get more money out of desperation. No, He shook his head, feeling increasingly suffocated by guilt. That's not it. It was at this moment that the unexpected happened. Turning the corner, talking distractedly on his cell phone, appeared Raphael. Alexandra saw him first and froze mid-sentence. His son was walking exactly toward them, probably going to meet Isabella before work, something that wasn't in Alexandra's calculations. Isabella, with her back to the street, didn't notice Raphael's approach. She continued looking at Alexandra, concerned about his sudden hesitation. "Are you all right? Are you feeling pain again?" Alexandra couldn't respond. He saw his elaborate plan crumbling before his eyes. In seconds, Raphael would recognize him, even with the disguise. At that exact moment, Raphael looked up, moving the phone away from his ear. His eyes found Isabella first, kneeling on the sidewalk, and then the shabby figure beside her. For an instant, there was no recognition, just surprise at seeing his fiancée talking to a homeless person. Then, something changed in Raphael's look. He frowned, took a few more steps, and Alexandra saw the exact moment when understanding hit his son. "Dad?" The word echoed on the busy street, making Isabella turn abruptly. Her confused gaze alternated between Raphael, who was now rapidly approaching, and the man beside her, whom she knew as Augusto. "Raphael? What do you mean, Dad?" Isabella stammered, the confusion evident in her voice. Alexandra felt as if the world was slowing down around him. Raphael's face showed a mixture of shock and growing fury. Isabella's eyes, once so gentle, now reflected incomprehension and the beginning of what seemed to be a deep hurt. "What does this mean?" Raphael demanded, his voice trembling with anger as he stared at his father. "What are you doing dressed like this? Why are you talking to Isabella this way?" Alexandra began to get up slowly, all his elaborate explanations and justifications evaporating in the face of the raw reality of the situation. "Raphael, I can explain." "Explain what?" Raphael cut him off, his tone icy. "That you're disguising yourself as a beggar for what exactly? To deceive my fiancé?" Isabella was now standing, her face pale as she began to understand what was happening. "You're Raphael's father?" she asked Alexandra directly, her voice strangely calm, a calmness that he recognized as the prelude to a storm. "You're Alexandra Ribeiro?" The silence that followed was his confession. Alexandra saw the exact moment when complete understanding hit Isabella. Her eyes widened, her breathing faltered, and an expression of absolute betrayal took over her face. "You deceived me," she said, the words almost a whisper. "You pretended to be ill, pretended to need help, made me buy medicine, made me be late for work, made me worry about you." Her voice was gradually increasing. "Made me look for you for days. And now you are going to take my money? Money that I barely have? No!" Alexandra protested, the homeless mask completely forgotten now. "I would never take your money. It was just a test." The words came out before he could think better, and immediately he realized his mistake. "A test?" Raphael's voice was pure ice. "You were testing Isabella?" Alexandra looked at his son, seeing in him the same look of disappointment that Helena used to give him when he put business above family. "Raphael, I just wanted to be sure." "Sure of what?" Isabella interrupted, her voice trembling. "That I wasn't a gold digger? That I really cared about people?" A small crowd was beginning to form around them, attracted by the growing discussion. Alexandra noticed Marcelo approaching discreetly, ready to intervene if necessary. "Look, we can talk about this in a more private place," Alexandra tried, aware of the curious looks. "There's nothing to talk about," Raphael replied firmly. "What you did is unforgivable, using your power and money to manipulate people, to test the integrity of someone you barely even know." "Raphael, Alexandra began, but Isabel interrupted him. "Do you know what's saddest?" she said, tears now flowing freely down her face. "I really cared about you, about Augusto. I spent nights wondering if you were okay, if you had gotten your medicine, if you were eating properly. And all of this was an elaborate lie." The guilt Alexandra felt was like a physical weight on his chest. Seeing Isabella's face marked by tears, he understood the extent of his mistake. He hadn't just tested her integrity, he had played with her feelings, with her genuine compassion. "Isabella," he said softly, "you're right. What I did is inexcusable, but I need you to know that you passed the test with distinction. You proved to be exactly the person my son deserves." She looked at him with incredulity. "You think this is about passing your test? That I want your approval? What you did wasn't just testing my character. It was doubting it from the beginning, without even giving me a chance." Raphael put an arm around Isabella's shoulders. "Let's get out of here," he said, giving his father one last icy look. "We have nothing more to say." Alexandra took a step forward, desperate. "Raphael, son, please!" "Don't call me son now," Raphael replied, his voice breaking slightly. "A father doesn't do what you did. A father trusts his son's judgment. A father respects his son's choices." With those words, Raphael turned to leave, gently guiding Isabella. The crowd made way, many still looking curiously at the strange man dressed as a homeless person, but clearly not being one. "The car is waiting, sir," Marcello said softly, approaching. Alexandra nodded mechanically, unable to take his eyes off the figures of his son and Isabella walking away. At that moment, he understood that his obsession with control, with certainty, with protection, had potentially destroyed something precious. On the way back to the mansion, Alexandra remained silent, slowly removing parts of the disguise. The wig, the fake beard, the makeup that created additional wrinkles, each element falling beside him on the car's leather seat like fragments of his own arrogance. "You knew this could happen," Marcello commented, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation. "Yes," Alexandra admitted, "but I thought the risk was worth it. I thought I was protecting my son." "From what exactly?" asked Marcello, with unusual frankness for an employee. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Alexandra looked out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur. From what exactly was he trying to protect Raphael? From another Carolina? Or from something deeper? From the fear that his son might find a true love that he himself had never managed to maintain? Upon arriving at the mansion, Alexandra went directly to his office, ignoring Jose the butler's concerned question. He sat heavily in his leather chair, staring at the photo of Helena that he kept on his desk, the only concession to sentimentalism in an environment dominated by functionality. "I messed it all up, didn't I?" he murmured to the smiling image of his deceased wife. "Exactly as you always said I would with my distrust." Alexandra tried to call Raphael repeatedly in the following hours. All calls were directed to voicemail. He sent messages that went unanswered. When night came, he found himself alone in the huge dining room, an untouched plate in front of him, the silence of the mansion more oppressive than ever. 3 days passed without any contact from Raphael. Alexandra alternated between unanswered calls and moments of resignation. On the morning of the 4th day, when he was already considering going personally to his son's apartment, the mansion's doorbell rang. Jose announced that Isabella was at the door, asking to see him. Alexandra felt his heart race. He hadn't expected this. He nervously adjusted his tie and took a deep breath before authorizing Jose to escort her to his office. When Isabella entered, Alexandra barely recognized her. Not because of her physical appearance. She wore simple clothes as always, no makeup, her hair tied in an unpretentious ponytail. The difference was in her posture, in the hardness of her gaze, in the complete absence of the warmth that had so impressed him. "Mr. Ribeiro," she greeted formally, refusing with a gesture his invitation to sit down. "Isabella," he replied, uncertain how to proceed. "I appreciate you coming. I tried to talk to Raphael, but—" "I know," she interrupted him. "That's why I came. Not for you, but for Raphael." Alexandra nodded slowly, accepting the deserved coldness. "How is he?" "Hurt," Isabella replied directly. "Furious, ashamed, mainly deeply disappointed." Each word hit Alexandra like a well-aimed arrow. "Raphael feels that he betrayed my trust by not telling me about your suspicions," she continued. "He feels that somehow he is responsible for what happened, for not having protected me from you." "He's not to blame for anything," Alexandra hastened to say. "The responsibility is entirely mine." "I know that, and he knows it too, rationally. But emotionally, he's destroyed." Isabella paused, as if carefully choosing her next words. "I came here to say that, despite everything, I'm not going to break up with Raphael because of what you did." Alexandra felt momentary relief that was soon dispelled by her next words. "But I also came to say that I don't want you at our wedding." The firm declaration hit Alexandra like a physical blow. "Isabella, please!" he began, but she raised her hand, interrupting him. "I'm not finished." Her voice was calm. but relentless. You clearly showed what you think of me. You showed that no evidence of my character would be enough, that no demonstration of love for your son would be sufficient to convince you of my intentions. Submitting someone to a test like that? She shook her head, incredulity still evident in her gaze. That reveals more about your character than anything I might have done could reveal about mine. Alexandra felt the weight of these words, their undeniable truth. Rafael and I are leaving Sao Paulo, Isabella continued. He resigned from the company yesterday. What? Alexandra couldn't contain his surprise. Rafael was the vice president of international operations, the natural heir to the empire. He can't just... He can and he did. Isabella cut him off firmly. He received 3 offers in the last few months and accepted one in Portugal. We're starting over, away from here. The news fell like a bomb. Alexandra felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. His son, his only son, his most important connection to Helena, the future of everything he had built, was leaving. Because of him. When? Was all he could ask, his voice almost inaudible. In 2 weeks, replied Isabella. We've already started packing. Alexandra sank into his chair, trying to process everything. 2 weeks, just 2 weeks to fix the damage of decades of distrust, of excessive control, of inability to accept that his son was an adult capable of making his own choices. Why are you telling me this? He finally asked. Why did you come here? Isabella hesitated for the first time since entering the office. For a moment, Alexandra glimpsed again the compassionate woman who had helped a stranger on the street. Because despite everything, you are his father, she replied softly. And because, unlike what you think, I really love your son. I don't want him to carry the weight of leaving without saying goodbye, without resolving things with you. That would destroy him gradually, even if he doesn't admit it. Alexandra felt his eyes burn with contained tears. The irony was almost unbearable. The woman he had judged and tested, the woman whose compassion he had exploited, was now the one showing consideration for his feelings. What can I do? He asked, his voice breaking. How can I fix this? Isabella looked at him for a long time before answering. Start by respecting his decision. Don't try to manipulate. Don't try to control. Don't try to buy his forgiveness. If you really want to fix things, you need to accept that you've lost the right to dictate the terms of reconciliation. The words were harsh, but fair. Alexandra nodded slowly. And one more thing, added Isabella, already turning to leave. That stone you gave me when you were pretending to be Augusto, I still have it. I'll keep it as a reminder. A reminder of what? Alexandra asked, confused. Isabella looked at him one last time, her expression softening slightly. That sometimes people who seem to have everything may, in fact, have lost what's most important. With those words, she left, leaving Alexandra alone with the weight of his choices and the devastating prospect of a future without his son nearby. That night, sitting alone on the veranda where he had so often discussed business, Alexandra contemplated the city he had helped build. Imposing buildings, avenues that bore his name, hospitals and schools funded by his foundation. All achievements that now seemed empty in the face of the possibility of losing the only person who really mattered in his life. That was when he made a decision he never imagined he would be capable of making. The Sao Paulo sky dawned grey that Friday, with a fine drizzle that seemed to reflect Alexandra's state of mind. Sitting in the back seat of his Rolls-Royce, he distractedly observed the raindrops running down the window while Marcelo drove through the congested streets of downtown. "Are you sure about this, sir?" asked Marcelo, glancing briefly in the rearview mirror. Alexandra didn't respond immediately. The folder of documents in his lap weighed like lead, not for its physical content, but for what it represented. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," he finally replied. When the car stopped in front of a middle-class residential building in the Pinheiros neighborhood, Alexandra took a deep breath before getting out. Without the usual umbrella held by an assistant, he let the drizzle wet his impeccable suit as he walked to the entrance. The doorman recognized him immediately. After all, Alexandra Ribeiro's photo frequently appeared in magazines and newspapers, and seemed momentarily confused to see the billionaire alone, without security guards or advisors. "I'm here to see my son, Rafael Ribeiro, apartment 702, Alexandra calmly informed. After a quick call, the doorman nodded. "You can go up, Mr. Ribeiro." In the elevator, Alexandra mentally rehearsed for the 100th time the words he would say. When the door opened on the 7th floor, He felt an anxiety that not even the most important negotiations of his career had provoked. It was Isabella who answered the door. She seemed surprised, despite having authorized his assent. "Mr. Ribeiro," she greeted formally. "Alexandra," he corrected gently. "Please." She hesitated before stepping aside, allowing his entry. The apartment was modest, but welcoming. Semi-open cardboard boxes occupied part of the living room, silent witnesses to the imminent move. Raphael emerged from the hallway, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, so different from the tailored suits he wore at the company. His face hardened upon seeing his father. "What do you want?" he asked directly. Alexandra swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the distance between them. "We need to talk, son. Please." Raphael exchanged a look with Isabella, who nodded discreetly before saying, "I'll prepare some coffee. You have a lot to talk about." When she withdrew to the kitchen, father and son sat face to face in the small living room. The silence between them seemed insurmountable. "Are you really leaving?" Alexandra finally asked. "Yes," Raphael replied firmly. "It's already decided." Alexandra nodded, accepting the reality he had so feared. "I understand." "Do you really?" Raphael questioned, the bitterness evident in his voice. "Because you didn't seem to understand anything about me when you decided to test my fiancée as if she were a job candidate at the company. The criticism was fair, and Alexandra didn't try to defend himself." "You're right," he admitted. "I didn't understand. In fact, I've misunderstood everything for a long time." He paused, searching for the right words. "When your mother died, I promised myself I would do everything to protect you. But at some point, protecting transformed into controlling. I confused love with possession." Raphael remained silent, but something in his gaze indicated he was listening. "When you told me you were going to marry Isabella, my first instinct was to protect you from the pain I felt when I lost your mother. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, that the end justified the means." Alexandra shook his head, the regret evident in every gesture. "But what I did was unforgivable, not just to Isabella, but to you. I didn't trust your judgment. I didn't respect your ability to make your own choices." "It wasn't the first time," observed Raphael. "No," agreed Alexandra. "It was just the worst of many times I interfered in your life, thinking I knew what was best for you." Silence settled between them again, heavy with decades of unspoken expectations and accumulated resentments. "Why did you come today?" Raphael finally asked. "To try to convince me to stay? To offer more money? A better position in the company?" Alexandra opened the folder he had brought and handed a set of documents to his son. "I came to bring this." Raphael took the papers with hesitation, his eyes quickly scanning the content. As he read, his expression changed from distrust to absolute surprise. "This is, you're transferring control of the holding company to me? And selling your shares in the real estate developer? What does this mean?" "It means I'm retiring," replied Alexandra simply. "The holding company is yours now, to run as you see fit or sell if you prefer. As for the developer, I've already accepted an offer from the Spanish group that had been courting us for years." Raphael seemed stunned. "But why?" "Because I finally understood what your mother tried to teach me for years," explained Alexandra, his voice softening at the mention of Helena. "That no empire is worth losing those we love. That control is not the same as connection." He paused, feeling strangely light as he pronounced words he had rehearsed for days. "I'm going with you to Portugal." The declaration fell like a bomb in the small apartment. Raphael widened his eyes. "What?" "If you'll accept me, of course," Alexandra quickly added. "Not to interfere in your lives, not to work with you, just to be close, to try to rebuild what I destroyed. I bought a small house on the outskirts of Lisbon, 40 minutes from where you'll be living." Isabella chose that moment to return with the coffee, clearly having heard part of the conversation. Her gaze was full of surprise, but there was something more, a cautious hope. "You would do that?" asked Raphael, the incredulity evident in his voice. "You would leave everything here? Your empire, your business, your control over everything and everyone?" Alexandra smiled sadly. "Son, what is the value of an empire without an heir who cares about it? What's the point of so much control if it drives away the only people who matter?" He glanced briefly at Isabella before continuing. "I learned the hard way that certain things cannot be bought, controlled, or manipulated. True love is one of them." Raphael seemed speechless, running his fingers over the documents as if trying to confirm their reality. "And if it doesn't work out?" he finally asked. "If we can't overcome this?" "Then I will have tried," replied Alexandra simply. "And that will already be more than I've done in recent years." A reflective silence settled in the room. Alexandra observed his son processing everything that was happening, the magnitude of the change, the symbolism of his decision. It was Isabella who broke the silence. "Can I talk to you for a moment, Raphael?" she asked, gesturing toward the kitchen. While the couple conversed in low voices in the other room, Alexandra remained seated, feeling a strange peace he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to control the outcome of the situation. He had made his offer, expressed his regret, and now the future depended on other people's decisions, a sensation simultaneously terrifying and liberating. Minutes later, Raphael and Isabella returned. There was a new resolution in the gaze of both. "We need time," said Raphael directly. "I can't promise that everything will return to normal immediately." "I understand," Alexandra nodded. "But," continued Raphael after a significant pause, "Portugal is a country big enough for all of us." The simple words carried an enormous weight. It wasn't a warm embrace or immediate forgiveness, but it was a door left ajar, a possibility. "And," added Isabella, her voice softer than Alexandra expected, "perhaps you can come to the wedding after all." Alexandra felt his eyes moisten. "I don't deserve." "No," agreed Isabella sincerely, "but perhaps it's not about deserving. Perhaps it's about family, about second chances." Alexandra couldn't contain the tears that now ran freely down his face. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself this vulnerability in front of other people. "Thank you," was all he could say. 6 months later, Lisbon, Portugal. The spring sun bathed the small garden where dozens of white chairs were organized in perfect rows. Wildflowers in shades of lilac and white decorated the central corridor, and a simple pergola marked the spot where the bride and groom would exchange their vows. In the background, the Tagus River reflected the golden light of the late afternoon, creating a scene of serene beauty. Alexandra nervously adjusted his tie as he observed the guests arriving. He wore a light-colored suit chosen by Raphael, a significant change from the dark tones he had always preferred in Sao Paulo. But the change in his appearance was just a reflection of much deeper transformations. The small house he had bought on the outskirts of Lisbon had become an unexpected refuge. Away from the pressures of managing an empire, Alexandra discovered simple pleasures he had never had time to appreciate. Reading for hours on end, walking around the neighborhood without security guards, talking with neighbors who had no idea who he was or how much money he possessed. His visits to Raphael and Isabella began in a tense manner, limited to brief dinners and polite but superficial conversation. With time, however, something began to change. It wasn't a specific moment, but a series of small instances. Raphael asking his opinion on an investment, Isabella inviting him to see her new school, both appearing without warning on a Sunday for coffee. The healing was slow but steady. What surprised him, however, was discovering that the problem had never been just the lack of trust in Isabella. It was the inability to trust himself, to believe he could be loved without his money, without his power. His thoughts were interrupted when he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Raphael, impeccable in his navy blue suit, the nervousness of the groom evident in his smile. "It's time," said his son. Alexandra nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "Are you ready?" Raphael smiled. "More than ever." A year ago, Alexandra would have occupied a prominent place in the front row, a visual demonstration of his status and importance. Today, he had chosen a discreet seat among the guests, not out of shame or punishment, but from understanding that this moment wasn't about him. When the music began and everyone stood up, Alexandra felt his heart accelerate. Isabella appeared at the beginning of the corridor, radiant in a simple and elegant dress. She walked alone. Her father, unfortunately, had not been able to overcome his own demons and was absent from the ceremony. As she passed by Alexandra, Isabella did something he would never have expected. She paused briefly, leaned in, and whispered, "Thank you for being here." It was such a brief moment that many guests didn't even notice, but for Alexandra, it carried the weight of an absolution he didn't know he was seeking. The ceremony proceeded with the simplicity that characterized the couple: sincere vows, genuine smiles, uncontained tears. Alexandra observed everything with a mixture of pride and humility. Pride for the man his son had become, humility for finally understanding that this merit wasn't his. During the reception, Alexandra remained discreet, conversing politely with the few guests he knew, mainly Raphael's colleagues from the new company. It was during this moment of tranquil observation that Isabella approached, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "For the father of the groom," she said, offering him one of the glasses. Alexandra accepted with a grateful smile. "For the most beautiful and generous bride I've ever seen." They toasted in silence, the past hovering between them. Not forgotten, but also no longer an insurmountable obstacle. "You know," Isabella began after a moment, "that stone you gave me when you were pretending to be Augusto. You still have it?" Alexandra asked, surprised. She nodded, taking from the small hidden pocket in her dress the same smooth stone he had given her that day on the sidewalk. "I carried it with me today." "Why?" Alexandra couldn't hide his perplexity. Isabella looked at the small stone in her hand. "At first, I kept it as a reminder never to completely trust appearances." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "But today, it means something different. It reminds me that people can change, that they can choose a better path, even after terrible mistakes." The words deeply affected Alexandra. "I don't deserve your understanding, Isabella." "It's not about deserving," she replied, echoing the words from 6 months ago. "It's about choosing to forgive, not just for others, but for ourselves." She looked beyond him, to where Raphael was animatedly conversing with some friends. "Your son loves you, Alexandra. He always has, and part of him always hoped that you would finally see him for who he is, not for what you wanted him to be." Alexandra felt the weight of these words, their unquestionable truth. "I'm trying," he said simply. "I know," Isabella smiled. "And that's all any of us can do. Try every day to be a little better than we were yesterday." She moved away to join her husband, leaving Alexandra with thoughts that would have seemed alien to him a year before. The man who had once measured value only in numbers now understood the meaning of wealth that couldn't be accounted for. That night, when the party ended and the guests dispersed, Alexandra walked alone on the beach near the reception venue. The full moon illuminated the gentle waves breaking on the sand, creating a silver path over the sea. He removed his expensive shoes, feeling the sand between his toes, a simple sensation he hadn't experienced since childhood. He breathed deeply the salty air, filling his lungs with the freedom of a man who finally understood that the control he had so valued was, in fact, a prison he had built himself. In his pocket, he felt the weight of a small object, a new stone, different from the one he had given to Isabella, but similar in its simplicity. He had collected it from the beach the previous morning during his daily walk. It would be his own talisman, his personal reminder. Alexandre Ribeiro, the man who had built an empire based on concrete and steel, now found meaning in a simple stone, in the waves he couldn't control, and in the love of a son he had finally learned to accept for what he was, not for what he could become. And in that moment, under the starry sky of Portugal, so far from the skyscraper that had once defined his worth, Alexandra felt truly rich for the first time in his life.